Hello, and welcome to today's Conversation Starter segment with the Jewish Museum Milwaukee, and our very special guest today, Amy Spitalnick, who is the Executive Director of Integrity First for America. So first of all, welcome, Amy.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for being with us. So we are really excited to have an opportunity, having done a program back in October where we talked about this landmark case surrounding the events that happened in Charlottesville in 2017. And since that program happened in October, as we're talking, getting ready for the broadcast, it seems like simultaneously it's been years and a minute since that has happened. Just news is moving so quickly and updates are happening so quickly, and particularly in connection with with the riot at the Capitol on January 6th. So just to give a little bit of background for people who maybe weren't able to join us for that program back in October, 3 years ago, white supremacists meticulously planned and carried out a violent attack on Charlottesville that resulted in dozens of injuries and the death of Heather Heyer. Fast forward 3.5 years, with far-right extremists even more emboldened by years of disinformation, conspiracies, and hate, we witnessed an unprecedented attack on Congress by violent insurrectionists intent on disrupting our peaceful transition of power and harming our nation's leaders. So today we have with us, as I mentioned, Executive Director Amy Spitalnick from Integrity First for America. Amy is head of the organization that is a nonpartisan civil rights nonprofit that's backing the landmark federal lawsuit filed by a coalition of Charlottesville community members against neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for the August 2017 violence. Amy has extensive experience in government, politics, advocacy, including as communications director and senior policy advisor to the New York Attorney General, communications advisor and spokesperson for the New York City Mayor, and communications director in the New York State Senate. She's also worked on a number of federal, state, and local campaigns and advocacy organizations. She's also been the recipient of numerous honors and accolades, but we want to delve right into this conversation. So I know we're going to show a clip here, but before we do that, can you take us back to 2017 and describe for us what actually happened in Charlottesville?
Yeah, well, if it's okay, I'll start by showing the short clip, because
Sure.
I think that will set the stage, and then I'll sort of build on that, because I think some of the images and sounds from 3.5 years ago in Charlottesville, I imagine will both, we like to warn people, are somewhat disturbing, and you should know that before we show this video. Of course, this is not the easiest of topics, but I also think it's important to remember what happened there, and use that to really inform our conversation for the next 25 or so minutes. So I'm going to share my screen now and get this video up there. Let's see. There we go.
Charlottesville. Stark displays of racism.
Trying to promote my heart has landed the crowd.
They've been thrown in the air. The act of domestic terror.
One woman dead, others wounded.
10 of the people who were injured in Charlottesville, including 3 of the people who were hit by that car and survived, have now brought a lawsuit against not only the murderer who drove his vehicle into the crowd, but also the leaders of all of the white nationalist groups that organized and promoted the Charlottesville event.
We are Integrity First for America. We are here to disrupt the extremism, to interrupt the cycle, to dismantle and bankrupt these hate groups and their leaders, to put them out of business, and most importantly, to stop violence. Integrity First for America is leading the fight against white supremacy. Our Charlottesville lawsuit is the only current legal effort taking on the broad leadership of this movement, holding white supremacists accountable for their premeditated violence. We know that it's working. They're already facing huge financial and legal consequences, but we also know what we're up against. Bankrupting Nazis isn't cheap. These groups are still recruiting, weaponizing fear, and preparing for their next attack. Now more than ever, we are reminded of our obligation to dismantle the systems of white supremacy that poison this country. Turn your outrage into action, because hate has no place here.
Okay, wow. So incredibly powerful, lots of information there, difficult images to watch. I know we had a little bit of feedback there, so thanks everyone for bearing with us. I think that was just because of the added video, and once that kind of subsides, hopefully the feedback will calm down a little bit. So, so keying off of that video, let's launch into this conversation about what happened and how this case came about.
Absolutely. I think it's so easy to forget that in American cities just 3.5 years ago, neo-Nazis were so emboldened and so empowered that they were able to storm that city, bringing violence, bringing hate, bringing destruction with them.
Amy, sorry to interrupt you. We seem to be having some continued feedback here. I don't know if there's anything else that can be kind of turned off on your end or turned down, maybe.
There's nothing else that is open here.
Okay. All right. So we may sound a little bit robotic, but we'll continue on. Sorry about that.
So, as I was saying, 3.5 years ago in American cities, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups were so emboldened that they stormed the city, bringing with them violence, destruction, and bigotry. And first, they even made us remember viscerally watching the Tiki Torch March on the night of Friday, August 11th, where these extremists stormed the University of Virginia, chanting things like "Jews will not replace us" and "Blood and Soil."
There we go. Sorry, you just kind of converted back to.
Perfect. Great.
Okay, great.
Well, first on Friday, August 11th of 2017, these neo-Nazis stormed the University of Virginia, chanting things like "Jews will not replace us," "Blood and Soil." They am I cutting out again?
No, you're great. You're great.
Oh, great. And chanting things like "Jews will not replace us," "Blood and Soil." They surrounded this group of counter-protesters at the Thomas Jefferson statue, kicked them, punched them, beat them up, threw fuel and lit torches. One of our plaintiffs who was there that evening, an African-American undergrad, said he thought he was going to die. And nearby, an interfaith gathering had to shelter in place because it just became too unsafe outside those doors, ironically, because this was a space created for the faith community to come together, knowing that white supremacists were descending on their town. The next day, Saturday, August 12th, I think we all know how the day ended, culminating in the car attack that killed Heather Heyer and injured many of our plaintiffs and others. But it was truly a day and a weekend of violence. These neo-Nazis surrounded the local synagogue in downtown Charlottesville, chanting things like Sieg Heil, carrying semi-automatic weapons. The synagogue had to evacuate people and Torah scrolls out the back. And the detail that gets me every single time that I think I shared as well at our October event, but I think is worth repeating. The synagogue was home to a scroll that was saved from Nazi Germany, a Holocaust scroll. And the fact that this Torah scroll was somehow under Nazi threat here in America in 2017 is just so a perfectly horrific and sad encapsulation of what's at stake here. The violence continued, of course, throughout the day, charging a line of interfaith clergy, including our plaintiff, Reverend Steph Wispelway. And ultimately, it culminated with the car attack that we all sadly know too well at this point, killed Heather Heyer, injured many of our plaintiffs, including, if you saw in that video, the photo of the car going through the crowd, you can see our plaintiff, Marcus Martin, who's the African-American man sprawled across the back, and many others who were grievously injured in that attack. And what's important to know is that nothing that happened in Charlottesville was an accident, but rather it was the result of meticulous planning for months in advance by the leaders of this extremist movement. And in these social media chats where they did the bulk of the planning, they discussed every detail from the mundane and banal, So what to wear, how do you best sew a swastika onto a flag, will mayonnaise spoil in the sun, what's the best gluten-free bread? When Hannah Arendt talked about the banality of evil, I think this is what she meant. But of course, they also talked about the vile and the violent, how they could use free speech instruments as weapons, so things like flagpoles that could be used to beat counter-protesters, and whether they could hit counter-protesters with cars and then claim self-defense, which is, of course, exactly what happened. And so that wasn't an accident. That was a racist, violent conspiracy. And in this country, we have laws that are meant to protect against that. So on behalf of a coalition of Charlottesville community members who were injured in that violence, we are taking to court 24 neo-Nazi white supremacists and hate groups most directly responsible for orchestrating and executing what happened. The suit uses a number of civil rights statutes and other laws, but the one that is always most of interest and is again in the news this month is something called the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. And this is a statute that was first passed 150 years ago to protect recently freed slaves from racist Klan violence in the South. And we are using it here in a way that I think is squarely within what it was designed to protect against, to take on the racist violent conspiracy we saw in Charlottesville. Just last week, Representative Benny Thompson and the NAACP also announced a lawsuit using the same statute against President Trump, Rudy Giuliani, the Oath Keepers, and Proud Boys for their role in the Capitol insurrection. And so there's a really stunning juxtaposition happening in which this law that was first passed 150 years ago is somehow new again, because relevant again in ways that I don't think anyone could have necessarily anticipated when it was first written. Because who could imagine so long after the Reconstructionist era we'd be facing a wave of white supremacist violence? So that's exactly what we're facing.
Yes. So we're going to get that feedback pretty badly. We'll try to continue working through it, and for everyone tuning in, again, I apologize. I'm not quite sure where the feedback is coming from. Amy, I don't know if you have headphones in the area. That might be something we can try, but we'll continue to move forward. So I think it seems to be coming in and out. So thank you for that background information, and we've started to kind of talk about those connections in terms of the event that happened January 6th. Before we kind of look at kind of how this case fits into the broader fight against far-right extremism, can you talk to us a little about the legal theory in the case?
Yeah, so the legal theory is that what happened was a racist, violent conspiracy. And using that Ku Klux Klan Act that I mentioned, it details how what happened wasn't protected speech and wasn't simply chatter, but was a meticulous plan to bring violence to Charlottesville. And that is what a conspiracy is. A conspiracy is a group of people coming together in pursuit of a criminal activity. And that is what we saw in Charlottesville, in which these defendants planned every last detail in advance and then went and did it. And so if they had simply gone to Charlottesville and stood on the street corner with their Nazi slogans and swastikas and vile bigotry, that would have been protected speech. That would have been allowed under the First Amendment. But that's not what they did. They went with the intent to plan violence, and then they brought that violence to Charlottesville. And that's not something that is protected in any sense by the First Amendment. The court agreed in its decision rejecting the defendant's motions to dismiss, saying that if we prove the facts as alleged in our complaint, this seems exactly in line with what the Ku Klux Klan Act was designed to protect against, and making clear that, quote, the First Amendment does not protect violence. And so it's really important, particularly at a moment when you have a number of extremists on the right who are using the First Amendment as a defense for their vile, bigoted violence. We should be very clear about what is and is not protected. And what happened in Charlottesville is something that is absolutely not protected by the First Amendment. The court agrees. A number of former ACLU leaders and others have been very outspoken about this as well in support of our case. And that is critical to understand at a moment when so many are trying to use that as an excuse to avoid accountability for their violence and their bigotry.
Right. So using that theory, using those, theories that you talked about, those, keying off of those acts, can you talk to us a little bit about how the case has already had a significant impact on some of the leaders of the white supremacy movement and their organizations?
Absolutely. So even before we get to trial, we've seen very significant impact. It's worth noting that in a civil suit like ours, we are not criminal prosecutors. We are not the Federal Department of Justice. We're not state prosecutors or local prosecutors. There's only so much that we can do as private citizens who are bringing a case. But a civil case like ours can have extraordinary implications and impact for this movement. Historically, if you look at some of the cases like the Michael Donnell case brought against the Klan in the South in the 80s, in which the Klan was effectively dismantled in parts of the South because of this lawsuit, you see how it can have very real impacts. And so we believe through this case that we can effectively bankrupt and dismantle many of the groups and leaders that are at the center of this movement. But even before we get to trial, which is this October, and before we win these large civil judgments against these defendants at trial, we've seen very real impact. We've seen defendants like Richard Spencer, who is perhaps one of the country's most famous neo-Nazis, talking about how he has been, quote, financially crippled by this lawsuit. We've seen a number of defendants like League of the South talk about how their operations have been impacted. They haven't been able to open a new building or go about their activities. Some defendants have faced very large financial sanctions already for their flouting of court orders. Some have even faced jail time, which I think is fairly extraordinary in a civil case like ours. And a few months ago, we won what's called adverse inferences, which is effectively an evidentiary sanction against a key defendant, in which the judge will instruct the jury at trial to treat as an established fact that Elliot Klein, this neo-Nazi, conspired to bring violence to Charlottesville, which is the allegation at the core of our lawsuit. So this means our plaintiffs have effectively won the case against Klein already, which is, again, pretty extraordinary in a civil suit like this. And so we've seen very real impacts even before we get to trial. And it's important both for the financial and operational impact it will have on our defendants. It's also important because it makes clear that there are very severe consequences for this sort of behavior, which has a deterrent effect on others who might consider being parts of these sorts of violent racist conspiracies. And it also shows that our case can really serve as a model for accountability at a moment when it has been so sorely lacking. And so we hope that this case is about not just what happened in Charlottesville a few years ago, but also can provide a pathway for the accountability and justice that we so desperately need in the face of broader rising extremism.
Exactly. So you started, you've mentioned some of the defendants. Can you talk a little bit more about the plaintiffs and the defendants in the case?
Absolutely. I'll start with the defendants because we actually just got about an hour ago some fascinating news related to one defendant, neo-Nazi Christopher Cantwell. Some of you might know him as the, quote, crying Nazi if you saw the Vice documentary on Charlottesville. He was just sentenced to 41 months in prison in federal court in New Hampshire this afternoon in a separate case, a case brought against him last year by the federal government for rape threats he made against a fellow white supremacist. It's there's so much to be said about the lack of accountability he's faced in general, because you won't be surprised to know that he has also been extensively threatening our team, including our lead counsel, Robbie Kaplan, and many others who have been outspoken against white supremacy, journalists and others. And so he sort of ironically finally faced charges not for threatening them, but for threatening a fellow white nationalist. Regardless, he's now going to be in prison for some time. And we think that is important, but we also think justice has not been fully served, and he is going to face trial in our case this fall in Charlottesville. But the defendants include a number of people who have very similar ideologies and tactics as Cantwell. Traditional neo-Nazis and white supremacists, including groups like National Socialist Movement, which is one of the country's largest neo-Nazi group, Richard Spencer, Andrew Anglin, who runs the neo-Nazi site The Daily Stormer, that I suspect some have heard of, and other white supremacist groups like Identity Europa, League of the South, certain KKK groups, Vanguard America, and many others. And these groups and leaders are really at the center of this white supremacist movement, and we know have deep and disturbing ties to the broader cycle of violence. So we know, for example, the Pittsburgh shooter communicated with some of the Charlottesville leaders before his attack on Tree of Life 2.5 years ago. We know that the Christchurch shooter who killed dozens of Muslims praying in mosques 2 years ago first donated to both Spencer and England, two of our defendants, and also painted onto his gun a white power symbol that was first popularized by another one of our defendants. And Christchurch was live streamed on social media, on Facebook, and that in turn inspired the Poway attack and the El Paso attack. And so we see over and over again how central our defendants have been to this movement and to sort of inspiring a cycle of violence in which each attack is used to encourage and inspire the next one. And so by going after these leaders and groups that are at the center of the movement and holding them accountable for the violence they brought to Charlottesville, we believe that this can have very significant impacts on the broader cycle at play here. The plaintiffs are, frankly, the bravest people I know. They are a coalition of Charlottesville community members who were significantly injured throughout the course of that violent weekend. Some at the University of Virginia campus, where they were surrounded at the Thomas Jefferson statue. Some during the car attack and peripheral violence on Saturday. Marcus Martin, who I mentioned earlier, who you see in that iconic Pulitzer-winning photo of the car, sprawled across the back. He had then pushed his then fiancee, now wife Marissa, out of the way, who was also a plaintiff. She was injured, but thankfully not as severely as she would have been had Marcus not pushed her out of the way. Thomas Baker, who you see flipping over the hood of the car in that photo. Natalie Romero, whose skull was fractured in the attack. Liz Sines, who is a University of Virginia law student and was targeted and injured both on Friday night and on Saturday during the car attack. Reverend Zach Wispelway, and many others. And I just think they're so incredibly brave for taking this horrific experience that they survived and channeling it into this case, which is not fast, it's not easy, but it's the option that they had that I think will have the most tangible impact in terms of their community and the broader fight for justice. And I think they're so incredibly brave for doing that. There were so many easier routes they could have taken. The fact that they chose this one is sort of a testament to how brave they are.
Absolutely. And again, for those watching us, I'm not quite sure what that feedback is. It keeps coming in and out, but thank you for sticking with us, and we'll do our best maybe once we've wrapped here to see what we can edit out once we post it. But thank you for talking about some of the plaintiffs, the defendants, some of their motives and their targets. You had mentioned in talking about some of the people involved, some of the threats that have taken place. And as you mentioned, some of those threats are being aimed at the legal team and at IFA. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So it's unsurprising, but still noteworthy, I guess, that neo-Nazis and white supremacists will use every tool they have to avoid accountability, and that includes using the threat of violence and harassment. And so they have been aggressive in targeting IFA, targeting legal teams, and targeting plaintiffs and others who are engaged in this case. And they use threats and harassment as a means to avoid accountability, as a means to scare us into not holding them accountable to this lawsuit. And so to be completely straightforward, the biggest challenge at IFA is security for that reason. It is important that we have monitoring rights on a daily basis that are as protected when we in trial this fall in Charlottesville. And it's certainly the concern that exists in a lawsuit like this against extremists who've proven their to have violence and also use social media as a means not just to harass themselves, but to also weaponize their followers and encourage them to take violent action against those that they view as problematic such as IFA. And so it's so critical that all of that is how to research to protect their community and
not let these extremists weaponize this harassment tool to avoid accountability.
Okay. Yeah. Very scary things that you're facing. And again, you mentioned some of the bravest people that you know involved with this. On January 6th, we saw a violent insurrection in the halls of the U.S. Capitol that in many ways used the playbook from Charlottesville. Can you tell us about some of the through lines from Charlottesville to the Capitol? You mentioned a little bit about it, but get a little bit more into detail and talk about what we can expect to see going forward.
Absolutely. I think there's so many ways in which the Capitol insurrection is the Charlottesville playbook on January 6th. Planning violence online to showing up prepared for violent war within tactical gear, to the extremists that they was at war of their violence. Including, of course, we saw images of Kessler, white supremacists, paraphernalia, and Confederate flags even used on outside the Capitol. And we were in bed, the few days after the Capitol attack, telling there's various parallels. We also know that to reward the Capitol attack is rooted in the fundamentally extremist and white supremacist idea, this idea of the country being stolen. Which harkens to some of the other conspiracy theories at play in Charlottesville and elsewhere. This idea of the white race being replaced, of their future being stolen in a conspiracy that was orchestrated by the Jews, meant to elevate various people of color, immigrants, refugees, and others. So there's so many parallels in terms of the tools and the tactics and some of the ideologies that we saw at play at the Capitol. What's important, though, is that in the aftermath of Charlottesville, there was so little accountability. Our suit really was the only effort to take on the broader leadership responsible. What we're seeing now is that at the very least there is a fairly robust level of accountability for the insurrectionists, and we see every day it feels like another charge being brought by the Department of Justice against these extremists, and in some cases, including as the case brought last week, private cases as well. We also think our Charlottesville case considers a model here for a broader conspiracy case that goes after the full conspiracy responsible for what happened. We're starting to see that percolate, including again with the private case brought last week, and some of the conspiracy charges brought by the Department of Justice against these extremists. But what we know at the end of the day is that accountability matters, and the lack of accountability over the last few years is one of the reasons this extremist movement has allowed to grow and evolve in ways that are just horrific and led to this. The awfulness of January 6th and the broader threat that we're now grappling with. And so, at a moment when it's so clearly necessary, having broad-based accountability is so crucial.
Okay. So, again, I apologize. I'm really concerned about how much of this people tuning in are actually going to be able to decipher in terms of the audio. So we'll see what we can do about that. And worst case scenario, I'm guessing Amy will be amenable to rescheduling and doing this again. So maybe what we should do is at this point, because this is such an important case and getting this information out and talking about your important work, everything that's going on is so crucial. I'm wondering if we should kind of wrap this up, a little bit early, and as I said, potentially look at, trying again so that we're sure to get this information out. But as it seems to be clear for the moment, the audio, as we're kind of wrapping up, can you just tell us a little bit about how we can help?
Absolutely. There's so much that people can do. This is an issue that has fallen off the radar screen quite often as the news cycle has moved on over the last few years after each attack. We can't let that happen. It's so crucial that we keep this issue front and center because it is a crisis. And everyone who's been following this and who is an expert, from the government officials like the Department of Homeland Security, who called it the most persistent and lethal threat to our country, to the ADL, to various other NGOs who track this, have made clear this is a crisis and that we are hitting record levels of extremism, hate, and bigotry in this country. And so there's so much you can do. First and foremost, support our case if you are so inclined. You can do so at integrityfirstforamerica.org. You can sign up for case updates. You can spread the word. If you'd like to donate, every dollar directly supports the case itself, and including and especially those security costs I mentioned. More broadly, though, hold your elected officials to account on the local, state, and federal levels. Make sure they know that this is a priority, and that at this critical moment when our eyes are finally open as a country to this threat, we want them to take action. We want them to make sure there's accountability and justice, that hate crimes are being prosecuted, that these extremists are being held to account, and that we are putting resources behind the efforts to address extremism in this country. Make sure social media companies are being held accountable to their obligations. No platform is obligated to give a space to violence, to hate, and to bigotry. That's, again, not what the First Amendment says. These are private platforms that are entitled to remove hate, violence, and bigotry from their platforms when it rears its ugly head. But many have been afraid to do so. And it's critical that we hold these private companies to account to their obligations there. And like I said, more broadly, just don't let this issue fall off the radar screen. Keep ringing the alarm bells, even when the news cycle moves on, because it's just too crucial for us to let it fall off the radar.
It truly is. I can't thank you enough for being with us, Amy. And as I said, I will probably look to trying this again because it is so crucial. So thank you for the important work that you do, for taking time out of an incredibly busy schedule with constant updates and figuring out how that is applicable to the case. So I will look forward to scheduling another time that we can talk further about the case, and I'm guessing further updates because that's how quickly things are moving. So thank you to our audience out there for tuning in. Again, apologize for the audio issues, a little bit out of our control, but we will, as I said, get this out, post it, and look to reconnecting with Amy and furthering this critical discussion. Thank you so much for being with us, Amy. Okay, bye-bye.